I'm going to kick things off today by speaking to you about what it is to have pioneer vision. I was thinking I couldn't have been married 47 years. I'm still only like 46. It's impossible. Actually, I was dubbed the pioneer, and I just had my 70th birthday, so I know. Praise God. That's all I can say. Praise God. 70. Who knew? So the thing I'm going to do today is tell stories. So I've not done that before at a feminine conference, but since we're talking about being pioneers, I'm going to tell some pioneer stories from the old days, ladies, what it was really like in Moscow. But every once in a while, a young couple will say to me, we're going to start a Christian community ourselves. We're going to go plant one. And I say, well, be prepared. It may take 40 years, you know. And to be honest, you know, there's so much involved in that. But when Doug and I got married and started having our kids, our mission, it never occurred to us to plant a Christian community. Not because we were against it. It just was not on our radar at all. So we were just doing the next thing. And we were just trying to bring our kids up faithfully before the Lord. That was our mission. And the community was something God did over the years. And it's such a surprise, really, to stand back. It was gradual, very gradual. But it's also a big surprise to all of us. So we're privileged to have been part of it, and that we're still part of it. We're very grateful. So I thought I'd just start at the beginning of the story. Why not? I was converted in 1973. I graduated from the University of Idaho in 1974. I started working for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and Community Christian Ministries 3 months after graduation. So how did a young Christian like me get involved with InterVarsity and CCM? Well, I'll tell you how. It was my future father-in-law's fault, Jim Wilson, who just passed away this last May at the age of 94. My last semester of college, I met Jim somehow. I don't remember exactly how that happened, but I did. And he opened a teeny tiny bookstore on the U of I campus called Care Paravel. So of course, I was just volunteering in the bookstore. I love books. I was a lit major. I'm a new Christian, eager, put me there. So I was sitting there. No one ever came in. I mean, it was just in an obscure little bookshop the size of a closet, really, in the campus Christian Center. But one day, Jim came in during my shift, and he sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit in there. And he said, I started asking me questions. He's really good at asking questions. Sometimes you don't want to answer, and I didn't sometimes say, I'm not telling you that. But anyway, he said, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I said, I don't know. I'm just going to look for a job of some kind. No ideas. And this is probably March-ish, before graduation. And all I knew is I wanted to get out of Moscow, basically, but I didn't know what kind of job, something exotic, exciting. So he said, well, what's your major? English lit. He said, well, you could teach. I said, no, I don't want to teach. I never want to teach. I never took an ed class on purpose. No. He was like, okay. So you could get married. I said, well, I'm not against it, but whoever he is, he's not in the picture. He said, or you could go on InterVarsity staff. It's like, I could? Wow, that would be wonderful. So there you go. That's what I did. But Jim had to arrange it. So there was an InterVarsity conference coming, and the regional director would be there, and Jim knew him, and he said, I'll introduce you, I'll talk to him. We'll get it set up. And I had been hitting every InterVarsity conference. They were really strong and good in those days, in the 70s. And very Bible-centered, inductive Bible study. It was wonderful. I just loved it. So at the conference, I never missed a conference. We got, Jim talked to the director, so forth. I met him. And so they got back to me and said, well, you haven't been a Christian long enough. You have to be a Christian 2.5 years to be on staff. However, we will take you as associate staff. If Jim will take you half-time working in the bookstore so that he can see how you're doing, spiritually. Well, that sounded great to me, so I was on board. So the only downside of the first job in my career as a graduate was neither position had a salary. But, it didn't stop me at all. It just didn't. I didn't have to raise support for InterVarsity. I didn't want to anyway. And associate staff don't get paid, so there was no reason to raise support. And Jim's line of work had no salary, but gifts would come in unasked for. They never published the needs or anything, and then whoever would divide it up amongst the staff. So I was pretty excited about, just trust the Lord. He will provide. So I was all in. As I look back on it, it's a little nervy to do that, but at the same time, it just all worked out. So in a very short time, I was in the bookstore working with Barbara, who was a very short Jewish lady, who is a gifted evangelist, just like Jim. Only she could get away with so much more because she was very little. And he was very intimidating to people. She wasn't. To me, she was a little. Because she was dynamo, just a dynamo. So I found a little furnished apartment in Moscow for $50 a month. And that was a pretty good deal, even then. I mean, later, Doug and I, our first apartment was $120, so $50 is pretty good. And it was furnished, it was great. But a little before my job started, I thought, I better make a trip to Moscow. I was living in Coeur d'Alene. I better make a trip, make sure, Jim is pretty hang loose about everything. I want to make sure I really have a job, check on my apartment, just, do the responsible thing, right? So I drove down to Moscow, popped in on Jim and Bessie, and their son Douglas was home on leave from the Navy. And that was really interesting. He was he was a very interesting guy right off the bat. Even though he had a Navy haircut, but I was, it was just an afternoon, but I was duly impressed. But he was going back into the Navy for another year, so onward. So I moved down in the fall of '74 and started working with InterVarsity in the bookstore. When I arrived to town, I got to my little apartment and there was a letter from Doug. And I opened it, very interested. And there was a check for $50, and that was my rent, ladies. God was already providing. And he said, in his letter, he said, I'm supporting, I'm a single sailor. I'm supporting some crusade staff and so forth. So I thought I would add you to the list, and he said, maybe you can write me back and tell me what's happening in the bookstore. I can tell you what's happening in the submarine. So, why are you laughing? So I have joked before, he was supporting me then and never quit. Still supporting me. But that $50 a month, it was that was an answer to prayer right there. My rent was covered for the whole year. If he was going to be submerged for 2.5 months, he would send me an advance check. And then, of course, I wouldn't hear from him, right, for that time. I'm glad he didn't do that after we were married. So during that time, and I especially want to mention this to you single women, I would say in the little Christian community, there were maybe a dozen single guys, none of whom I found, there's the one for me. It's just they were very nice guys. There were no women. I was like the only single woman. Sorry, I shouldn't slap the mic. And I was supposed to be co-leading Bible studies with these guys. So I don't know. I remember one night going to a study in the Student Union building, and I was going to co-lead it with another guy, and he hadn't prepared. Sorry, you're on your own. And it was all guys who showed up. And I thought, really? Somehow this doesn't seem my calling. At that time, I would ask the InterVarsity chief, so why do you have me teaching men? It seems like, I read the Bible, it seems pretty straightforward. It's like, it's because I'm in authority over you, and I'm telling you to do it, so it's okay. I remember thinking, these are older, mature Christian men, because Jim gave me the same exact answer. He had me teaching a noon study on campus on the book of Colossians. Professors were coming, and all kinds of people, men, women, and children, and I'm teaching Colossians because I had studied at an university. Okay, so anyway, this troubled me, as you can imagine. I remember telling the guys, I'm done with you all. I mean, you're on your own, because I'm not going to lead a Bible study for these guys. Later, I asked Doug, so what's with this? Why am I teaching Bible studies? And every time I double check the word, it doesn't have that in there about, well, unless your authority, your boss tells you to. And he just said, oh no, you should not be doing that. I was like, really? So that was very refreshing to me about him. So he knew what he thought, and he was never apologetic about it. Or didn't say, well, it's okay, don't worry about it. In fact, his mom was doing the same thing. He said, Mom, you should not be doing that either. So she quit too. We both did. Just teach the ladies. That's what we were meant to do. Anyway, so we have to move on here. We got married. Doug was on the GI Bill, not very much money. So we were trusting the Lord that he would help us make ends meet, especially since our rent was a whopping $120. Becca came along. Here's an example of the Lord providing. So we thought, everyone says you should wait a year before you have a child. So we were going to trust the Lord for kids. We weren't going to intervene in any way, but we asked him for a year. So a few weeks into our marriage, I started throwing up, and I thought, I have the worst flu. What is wrong? And it took me a minute to figure that out. But at any rate, Becca came 9 months after we were married. I'm so glad that we didn't adopt that idea. We couldn't get to know each other while I was throwing up. We got to know each other very fast. So fast forwarding, she was a little toddler, and one evening I just said, Doug, what are we going to do about school? I can't see taking her down to the government school. We probably called it public school then, and saying, here she is, teach her. I mean, back then, they were teaching really radical things like evolution. No, I mean, now, think of it. But at that point, we didn't want our kids to go there. But Doug answered me, and he said, don't worry about it. We'll get a Christian school started in time for her kindergarten year. And I was perked up. It's like, all right, let's go. And he got right on it. I mean, he got to work. Then, amazingly, many stories could be told about how God provided for Logos School teachers. At the very beginning, of course, there's probably no salary for anybody, just gifts. if gifts came. If they came, divided them up. So it was not a luxury kind of occupation to be teaching at Logos School. Doug started taking Latin at U of I so he could teach third graders Latin because we wanted to do this classical Christian model. Later, a few years later, fast forwarding, he wrote a book about it for Crossway, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. And then all of a sudden, our phones started ringing and letters started pouring in, and I was answering them all. I was answering letters by hand on the kitchen table and running up to Logos to ask the 5th grade teacher, like, what curriculum do you recommend they want to know? Anyway, it was out of hand. And the people on the East Coast never remembered the time change. Phone would ring. One time our son, by this time he was probably in high school, maybe junior high, but at any rate, he answered the phone, and the man on the other end from Georgia just started right in. Said, "Hey, Doug, we had this many parents at our back to school at our meeting, and what do you think?" And Nate said, "Oh, that's cool." And this went on for a minute, and then pretty soon he said, "Is this Doug?" And Nate said, "No." Anyway, those were exciting times. But I remember the day when I said, "Honey, you know, this is really getting out of hand. For me to keep up with all this stuff, I'm running up and handing out letters to people at Logos. Will you answer this one?" And he said, "I'm going to start an organization. We're going to get it off the kitchen table." And so that's where ACCS came from. And we held our first ACS conference at Logos School. The kids, our children, were busy making copies, as I recall. They were it was very exciting. The same thing happened for college. Becca was a senior and had no place to go. And I remember, you know, Doug had it on his radar, but I do remember one conversation, if you can call it that, as he was going out the door. I remember going, "Come on, honey, come on, let's get this done. It's coming, she's gonna be graduating in a minute." You know, so that was my style. Cheerleader, let's go. And he was all on board. I mean, I wasn't like chasing him. I don't want you to get the wrong idea, but I was cheering, like, let's hit it. So Becca got to start her freshman year, which took a lot of faith on her part, ladies. There were 3 other students, all male. But anyway, God blessed it, didn't he? I mean, it's just such an amazing story, that one in itself. But I haven't even mentioned the church. I have to mention the church. In the middle of 1975, probably the middle of August 1975, Doug is back from the Navy, but we're friends. We're not dating or talking about that. And we'd been going to Pullman to a church over there, had a couple hundred people. Doug's dad would preach one week, and another gentleman would preach. They'd rotate. And there were about 30 students or young people going over there from Moscow. So we had a meeting in Moscow, a little house next door to Jim's house. And Doug and I both went to that meeting, not together, but we went. And in fact, he thought I was with someone else, and it really spurred him on. But we had this little meeting to start the Moscow church. And so the next Sunday, we met probably in East City Park, or the man who was preaching, we met over his garage in a little room up there. And that was our church. A couple of years into it, I don't remember exactly how long, not long, he announced, our pastor said, "Well, this is my last week, good luck. Good luck, I'm moving, so whatever God leads you to do." Well, it was actually a mercy, because he had said something in a sermon not that long before where he mentioned abortion. And he said, "You know, if my wife and I got pregnant right now, we would have to really think about it." I looked at Doug, it's like, what? So anyway, it was a good providence that he called it quits and moved on. we didn't have to remove him. So the next week, Doug preached. I mean, who else was going to do it? It was just a little group, and he had been leading the Sunday school class and playing his guitar for this music, so that was his call, right there. And much against his will. I did not want to be a pastor's wife. I thought I'd have to play the piano and sing, and I don't know, I can sing, but not in the choir. And I certainly can't play the piano. I took accordion lessons in like 5th grade. But I just felt like I couldn't be that person, and he didn't want to be a pastor. We talked to a visiting missionary. It's like, what do we do? I mean, we don't want this job. And we had actually asked another man, Doug Busby, he pastored the E-Free Church in Pullman, he said, no, I'm called to Pullman. So we were stuck. And this missionary, I remember him, great encouragement. He said, well, guys, you're just going to have to put on your hip waders and slug it out. That was it. It's like, really? So at any rate, this is just to tell you, we didn't have this amazing vision for what was coming, but God just blesses day-to-day faithfulness. Our church grew. I mean, it struck me a few years ago, we never prayed for numbers. It never occurred to us to pray for numbers. And I remember being in a church once where that was a thing. You know, you pray for more people. Instead, we've been saying, Lord, help us to help all these people who are coming. So we just started going 1 week at a time to church. One time, we were meeting in a body and paint shop just up the road here. One time, one of the U of I students said to me, Nancy, where do you go to church? It's like, what are you talking about? He said, well, I never see you there, so I figured maybe this was Doug's thing and then you went somewhere else. It's like, my children have had chicken pox. I've been gone for 6 weeks. But I was there otherwise, and so were the kids. Some pretty crazy stories of those days. But I'm going to move on now. I know stories are important. I'm just giving you a clue of where we came from, and just a shift to some observations about being a pioneer. You may not know you are when you are. But how do we build community? The first thing to note is the men cannot do it by themselves, right? They need us. And many men get great ideas, but their wives talk them out of it, right? How will we pay the bills? What if it doesn't work? So we need to be more supportive, daring, I guess the word is sometimes. Women naturally think generationally. They're thinking about the kids and the grandkids and like, where are we going to educate this child? I'm thinking about the kids. And obviously, God blessed our desire to provide for our kids. But these traits, the two traits, one of women to think generationally, naturally we do that, but to also be kind of nervous, okay, about, but what if? Because we're conservative, we're risk averse, are we not? And so we don't want to be guilty of burying our talent or burying our husband's talent when they want to do something. We want to be wise, but we don't want to flinch. We don't want to flinch. Think of the Pilgrims. What if none of the women had come? Or the Oregon Trail. What if none of the women had come? It took a lot of guts for these women. What if they'd just been too afraid? And not that women should encourage recklessness, but they should honor far-thinking men who want to change the world and are willing to take a risk. So when it comes to women, if the men want to come to the new world, if they can get the women to come, The way my husband put it is, then you have a civilization kit right there. Without them, you don't. You don't. So, stories are important to tell. That's why I told stories today. And they're important for God's people to hear stories. The Old Testament is stories. Jesus told stories. They teach us. One of the things that we grew up with were missionary biographies, or our kids grew up with, lots of missionary stories. It's just good for us. We learn from one another. They teach us what to imitate and what to avoid. And obedience to God is always about doing and being. It's not just about sitting still and reading your Bible. It's about doing what it says. And stories are about how God works in the lives of his people. And of course, we can communicate them verbally or written, but this is what we want for our children. We want to tell them the stories. You've got to tell the stories. And you might want to write them down. But stories are incarnational. They embody the truth. I think back to this idea that God will provide for us. When we were first married, I told you I got pregnant right away, but my dad had felt like we were pretty extreme people, especially when we wanted to start a school. But he turned out to be one of the biggest fans and supporters. But at any rate, we didn't have health insurance. Health insurance was, one, it was too expensive, and we were just going to trust the Lord. But my dad really wanted us to have health insurance. So we took out a policy just to honor him. We're newlyweds or getting married. We took out a policy. We were married the end of December. The policy would cover 9 months from that day, October 5th. No, October 1st, sorry, October 1st. I got pregnant. Becca was due October 5th. She was born September 28th. 1 week early. Now, who does that with their first baby? And you know what? So our insurance didn't pay a dime. But we had that thing paid off, and we didn't tell people. Checks just came in the mail. Babies were a lot cheaper, but so was everything back then. We had it paid off so quickly. We just saw so many answers to prayer, even when we weren't praying about the specific thing, God providing. One time when our kids were little, and we were still in that, rather tight spot all the time, a friend of ours called and said, Nancy, he was in law school. He and his wife, I think they had a baby or two. He said, we have macaroni and no cheese, so we're coming to your house for dinner tonight. I was like, great. It's like, ah. And I thought, well, we have eggs. What can I do here? I was going to figure out something. I called Doug. It's like, heads up, we're having company for dinner. So that afternoon, our neighbor, a little sweet Korean lady, was asked if Becca wanted to come over. She was just a little squirt. And she was making Korean food. I said, sure, Becca, you want to go? She went down. We were in a duplex, so they were at the other end. And she came back a little later and said, Gyung is going to send over some samples. I said, oh, that's nice. I was expecting a plate with like a little taste of something. Well, as the dinner hour approached, all these casseroles came in the door. I mean, not casseroles, but casserole dishes full of Korean dishes. And we just had an enormous feast. And I didn't make any of it. And no scrambled eggs. It was just like God saying, see, I look after you in the most unexpected ways. So, at any rate, these kinds of stories, we love them. It's like when Doug was maybe 5, his parents were new to the ministry and were not very good at trusting the Lord yet. That's what they say. And they were out of milk and they were out of bread. And they thought, well, let's ask Doug to pray because he probably has more faith than we do. So they did. They asked Doug to pray for milk and bread. They called a little family prayer meeting. And, if you see the pictures, they were not languishing children. They were like fat-cheeked little kids. Anyway, so he prayed. Now, there is some disagreement about this next part of the story, whether it happened right after the prayer or the next day. But the way I always heard it growing, as our kids were growing up, was that right after he said amen, basically, the doorbell rang. And there was a milkman at the door, and he said, "Congratulations, you've won a year's supply of milk." Doesn't matter whether it happened then or the next day. So they had milk delivered. It was Christmas time, and they were just giving away milk. So this is why my husband can trust the Lord for things. I mean, God brought milk, guys, and a milkman right after he prayed. God can do anything. And I just think, what did that do for his faith and for his parents' faith and for mine, hearing that story? So tell these stories. All right. Finally, I need to wrap up, and I'm going to make it, guys. I think of it planting new Christian communities, and we're seeing it happen right here, like in the little towns around Moscow now. It's kind of like the strawberry plant that sends out that runner. And you need the connection for a while for that little plant to make it, right, to mama. Got to hang, close to mama for a while. But then it's up and going. And I just think that's kind of how God does this. You need a church because you can build schools and colleges, but you need a church. You need that weekly worship to hold everything together. And that's very important. That's what changes the world, one worship service at a time. And so many things have happened around us that we had nothing to do with. We have been like in the audience with everyone else, seeing what God has done and been so surprised and blessed. And even though around town people will tell you that my husband owns the whole town, actually, he says the only thing I own downtown is my pickup truck. And that's the truth. And I had to learn early on that the devil is the father of lies. And when we would open the newspaper, back when we took it, and see lies about our church on the front page, which happened many times. But I remember one of the first times saying, "Doug, hang on. This is not true. How can they put in something that's not true?" He said, "Nancy, it's the only weapon the devil has. It's lies. That's the only weapon he has. So be prepared. Don't believe everything in the paper or online." But that's helped me so much to remember that. That's the only weapon the devil has. So, of course, there will be lies. They lied about Jesus, else he wouldn't have been crucified. And it's our duty to follow after him, whatever comes, right? To be faithful. So, God is good. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed some of the stories, and now we're going to just press on. So, thank you.